Welcome to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Matt Tice.
I'm Rondo Moses. Hey, Matt.
Good to see you, Rondo. I'm really excited about today's discussion. We've got a guest coming on, Andrew Erickson from GMCT, to talk all about all things at the end of the healthcare value chain, looking at cemeteries and death tech, and really excited to hear from Andrew. This is a part of the economy we don't really talk too much about, but turns out there's a lot of innovation and certainly a lot of change in this industry. So we haven't profiled this part of the value chain before, so I think it'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm sure it's going to be quite interesting.
All right. So why don't we bring Andrew on? And what we'll do is we'll just jump right in and hear all about it. There he is. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Matt. How are you? And good
I'm
morning, Rondo.
terrific. Great to have you on the Insurgent
Andrew,
Mindset.
Thank you.
So, Andrew, as you know, the Insurgent Mindset really is all about exploring um, different facets of leadership and from a point of view of almost how to become and how to evolve to become the challenger, how to build a challenger culture, how to bring that culture into your business to teach people how to, kind of engage with the market, their customers differently in a way that's very front forward and disruptive. So in the podcast, Andrew, what we typically do is we'll pick an industry sector or a function or an individual. We'll try to unpack the industry. We'll try to unpack the leader and really get to the essence of what the insurgent mindset means for that leader and how it sort of works. So that's the plan for today. And basically, just as to get us started, we'd love to hear all about Andrew Erickson. So how did you come into this role? What are some of the challenges that led you to this role? And what's ahead for Andrew?
Um, there's a lot to answer in that, Matt, I've got to say, but how did I come to the role? Simply by saying yes. I think a lot throughout a career where the opportunities presented themselves and simply stepped into a lot of different spaces over time. And the type of industry we're in has multiple fronts across property development, construction, service delivery, governance, and a lot of government not-for-profit space, which combine them all, it can be quite a spread of experience, I suppose, that I think over my career saying yes to all the different things that I was faced with have made me more of a generalist type CEO. And given the breadth we cover, that's probably been one of the major things. But I came from building manufacturing plants. So building manufacturing plant for Toyota, building it for the concrete roof tiles, Monia Wunderlich. And so very much in that manufacturing space. But manufacturing, as you know, in Australia was more than challenged. And certainly during the global financial crisis was almost put on hold in terms of capital investment. So at that stage, I literally had to look around the industry, and I found myself actually finding a job that spoke about infrastructure operations in a horticultural environment was actually the heading, which just sounded like what I was doing in a nice environment. But when I started with cemeteries, the nice environment, that aspect of it was something that was unexpected. Working for a not-for-profit, working with community, making a difference to people's emotive state, supporting them and bringing a commercial lens to that was just something that said there's a whole new value to my skill set that I haven't necessarily realised before, where I can use the same experience, if you will, but there's a community where there's a direct contact, and that's been something that's made me stay. Would be the best answer to that.
Okay. And so in some ways, it's a very different widget that you're dealing with in your current role than, the previous role, say at Toyota. Maybe for our listeners, it would be useful to kind of give us a tour of what GMCT is, the boundaries, how does the industry work, just so that we can ground ourselves in an understanding of, what territory we're really discussing here.
So GMCT stands for Greater Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust. So in 2010, the government stepped in to the sector and brought some more order and rigour, because obviously it's critical infrastructure, as you can imagine. So they stepped in to provide some more rigour and set up a number of Class A cemetery trusts, which was an amalgamation exercise. And GMCT, as a result of that, looks after 23, I call them sanctuaries or parks, if you will, across metropolitan Melbourne. The revenue is around about 100 million, and we would look after 14,000 services per annum, and there would be 2 million visitors go through our parks on an annual basis, sort of exploring that park beyond the actual service itself. So that might give you a bit of an idea, Matt. On top of that, we are the only government agency that is self-funded that I'm aware of, in the sense that we must set our own fees. We have a responsibility in perpetuity, so therefore the financial modelling, given that we can only take a fee once and then we have to provide services in perpetuity, means the financial modelling is critical. And as a result of being able to set our own fees, we have this incredible sense of responsibility, if you will, that we are affordable, we are accessible, and that we maintain that sense of being a government not-for-profit that's in the sector providing essential service.
Perfect. One more question, then I'll flip it over to Rondo. What does a cemetery trust do, Andrew?
Now, are we talking about the trust or the actual organisation there, Matt?
Well, I think the organization, like, just give us a sense of what a day in the life is for the organization.
It's split. Probably the best way I'll answer that is across a number of directorates. So we have the community engagement team, where there's a lot of understanding, research and demographics analysis, combined with even the one-on-one and the community engagement workshops that we have to understand what the community's needs are, backed by data and an evidence base. And from that, we will then look at a park and build a new park, which we break down into, if you will, the park becomes a paddock. And on that paddock generally is a product, and that product is a preference that's been expressed to us from a particular community. So we have the research arm, and then we have the development arm, and then of course we move through to what I call the service delivery arm, which is that throughout the services, which might be a burial team doing interments, it would be a funeral services team managing the chapels, a gatehouse team receiving people when they arrive at the cemetery. You've got sales and service. So there's really quite a lot there. And then, of course, you've got your corporate structure behind that. You've got your HR, you've got your finance and so on. But in amongst all of that, we go right through to managing funds as well for the community, because it's their funds that are set aside. And from the interest of those funds, that's how we maintain their graves in perpetuity. So it's quite a complex range of skill sets that are all there. And of course, digital then is the great multiplier of our ambition.
So Andrew, just a clarification question. So how involved is the community in, or with the government, in terms of determining whether that park, as you described it, gets set in their area or not? Do they have a voice before the decision is made, or when are they engaged in the process?
So they're engaged more or less once we have the land. So we use demographics and obviously growth corridors to understand where the demand is. And amongst that, there's an expectation at the moment that we purchase that land. I think we could argue that there's a case to be prosecuted for just simply the setting aside of the land. But as it stands at the moment, we pursue the land. But then once we have that, again, we have the demographics that suggest the communities that we should begin to talk to. But also we have communities that are transitioning across from other areas. So we're very clear about what our decision-making tree is that might ask someone to cross boundaries and cross areas. So firstly, a person will make a decision on whether family is in that space. The second decision that's really important to them is actually their culture. Is it expressed there in a particular way? The third is distance from home and the ability to visit. And the last one sitting in there is actually price. Believe it or not, those other things are things that drive people to choice. And that, in our mind, is why we have to be so mindful of the fact that people are committed to a particular place, and we have to therefore be mindful that we're delivering that in an affordable way. rather than saying we've got a captured audience here, we can charge what we want. We've got a responsibility to make sure that accessibility and affordability is there.
Interesting, interesting. So I want to also step back, and I know that you're familiar with the insurgent concepts, and so, but I'm curious to understand how in your industry, in your sector, the cemetery sector, how do you see the insurgent mindset? How is that, operationalized inside your organization?
It'd be easier to answer you, Rondo, and tell you what's most obvious to us is the incumbent mindset, to be honest with you,
Mm,
because we're an industry that's been doing very much the same thing for well over 100 years. The average age of our parks is over 100 years. And so there's an enormous legacy and an embedded mindset about the way we do things. And the other part about the mindset too, I think, is this idea that I call it the curse of the caring, where people care so much they want to add a little bit of this or add a little bit of that, and it's a wonderful thought. But in so doing, especially across the breadth that we cover, when you start to introduce these wonderful initiatives, but there's lots of them, you start to cause a degree of confusion. And for
hmm
us, with an audience that is already cognitively impaired, we're in that space where actually, no, we need to start thinking about ways in which we build trust and reduce anxiety and use digital means to achieve that. But as a business, we need to shift from only being compassionate to being compassionate and commercial, and have those sorts of skill sets that start to challenge that very deep-seated mindset that we've got, that this is how we do it. We've also got a degree of fear, I suppose, too, in really shaking things up, and that's fair, because the last thing we want to do is negatively impact a family. That's absolutely the last thing we want to do. So there's very much a degree of safety that's been built in over the years that people are afraid to challenge, on the risk that it might upset the family when we've got a proven method now. So there's a real challenge there to start to shift the mindset, create a safe space for people to innovate, and then actually bring that in, because the customer has shifted in their expectation of how we deal with them. Particularly digital has made that change, but there's other ways in which other industries are influential in our space as well. So we're keen that we have a relevance for a long
hmm
time yet. So we can't let that gap between ourselves and the customer get wider. We must be those, and I know Matt uses the term customer proximity, which I love. You've got to stay constant and you've got to stay close. So we do have to make those steps of evolution, but certainly it's an organisation that doesn't want to hurt anybody and has a lot of legacy in it. So we're traditionally challenged in moving into that insurgent space, but we're starting to understand it a lot better.
Andrew,
And
I've got a
and
question for you.
besides the changing customer expectations and maybe even behaviors, what's the other sort of external forces that are you believe are really pushing for you to change and move beyond just the status quo?
We have, and it depends on which state in Australia, but there's also funeral directors that are in the decision-making tree for the family along the way. And they're not government, they're private. And so there's a value stream that takes place, and we're not the first phone call. So we often see situations where we may be offering a service that's cheaper as a government not-for-profit, but there's a lack of awareness that is there, such as purchasing a grave direct from the cemetery is GST free, whereas a lot of people aren't aware of that, and their first phone call is to a funeral director who guides them through the process and minimises the angst for them by organising the
hmm
grave for them. But there's that opportunity there perhaps to look at it differently and say, well, if a greater partnership or a sense of partnership about how we present GMCT further up that value chain, so that there's a fully informed person that can make those choices. That for us is the challenge when you're not the first phone call.
Interesting.
Andrew, I'm curious, you mentioned a moment ago customer proximity and the conservative incumbent nature of the culture. You also sort of mentioned digital. I'm interested in how those three things kind of come together. And, what's the consequence of staying in that incumbent mindset, given what sounds like there might be a fair amount of change, both in terms of your traditional audience or demographic, or however you want to describe that, your constituent base, changes in terms of their expectations and changes perhaps in, optionality of what families have available to them that maybe didn't exist before. So I guess what I'm really getting at is, what are some of the disruptive forces in your industry, and how are you adjusting to those? And how do you deal with this triangle of challenges, digital, changing demographics, and, also potentially expectations?
Matt, I could write a book and try to answer that, I reckon. We'll start with customer proximity, digital. I'm going to throw the word transformation in, because I think when we talk proximity, staying close to the customer, it's extremely important that an organization is able to maintain that customer proximity through a capability that allows you to transition continually, rather than create that space or have that space created for you by others, where you lose the proximity, and then you're looking at this word called transformation to try and take that space back. That the organisation has to shift dynamically, and larger organisations to shift dynamically in that space and in a often a short period of time. They call it a transformation, but really what we're trying to do is make a large gap when you've drifted that distance from the customer and others have filled that space. So I feel like that word of proximity is critical in understanding whether you're trying to transform because there's a gap that's widened and people have stepped into the space, and the best prevention of that is to stay close and to continually be able to transition. So I feel like they sit together, and a lot of people confuse digital as being the means to do that. And it's a tool, but it's not the answer. And I think a lot of people look to digital as though that's the gap. Whereas I don't believe that's the gap. I believe there are organisational practices that you have to have and capability that you have to be able to maintain that proximity, rather than think digital is going to get you there. By that I mean, I think a lot of organisations move down a path saying we're going to do digital transformation, without having understood the customer journey, without truly having understood their pain points and the customer's pain points. And so you'll find that a lot of organisations will call on externals to come and help them do a digital transformation. And when those externals arrive, they're just asking the same question. Well, what is your workflow? What are your pain points? And if you're not prepared, all of a sudden you've got a behemoth. Whereas understanding your customer pain points is something you should know as a good organisation and good practice. You should be continually aware of. And so digital is only going to multiply what you already are. So if you don't have those things in place, digital is actually going to multiply the fact that you've got a gap. It's going to feel extremely difficult if you haven't already got that business rhythm that understands that being close to the customer all the time is king. Making sure you understand the pain points and the way in which you're going to project it. Even brand, the way in which you project across digital channels, you need to have your brand already sorted. You need to have your value proposition already articulated before you start to multiply it through digital channels. And I think, again, a lot of people think that digital marketing and get a bit excited, but the way in which we express ourselves as an organisation or any organisation comes in many forms. And so for us, we know the one-on-one conversation in the grounds between the families and our staff is an incredible way of communicating to families, and our feedback says how important that is to people. Another way we express ourselves is actually the grounds themselves. So if you can imagine a grieving family turning into the park. Now, if the park was unkept that would be sending a message that would be distressing for the families. So the way in which you communicate, there's so many different channels, and to say, I'm going to do a digital transformation and we'll be back to the customer, I think is a little short-sighted, because those other expressions already exist and you need to be on top of those other channels as well. I've said a lot there. Matt might have triggered a question or two, but
no doubt we could go all day, Andrew. I think that's sort of, and that is really interesting, your point about customer first, digital second, and also just for the purposes of the audience, when we talk about customer proximity, mostly what we're talking about is reducing the distance between the firm and the customer, ideally to zero, so that you're as close as possible to the customer and or the consumer, which is something we're always striving for, but not necessarily something we ever kind of fully achieve. But I guess your point about transformation is really interesting in your industry. Is the cemetery of the future similar to the cemetery of the past? You mentioned this 100-year legacy. What's the same and what's different as you look over the horizon?
That's a really good question, one, Matt, and one I've spent a lot of time in consideration of. And for us to be relevant for all time, we need to understand what stays the same. And for me, human nature has not changed one iota since man began. Greed is still greed, envy is still envy, and in our sector, grief is still grief. And grief transcends faith, it transcends age or race. And so grief is, everybody feels grief. The truth is it is expressed differently. And over time, the way people express themselves, that evolves. So when we design a new park, we're very, I suppose, conscious of those. We have a park that is relevant forever, but also to be able to change the way it expresses over time. So when we design a park, we look at elements of the park that will support the stages of grief. So, for instance, when somebody first attends a funeral, they're often very blinkered in their views, and they're not aware of what's going on around them, and they're often helped and escorted. So there's a very insular view that at the start, but over time, people will want to emerge from that cocoon, and they might want to start to embrace what's around them, but they're not ready to just talk to people yet. So we have a lot of biodiversity built into the parks that allow people to sit in that reflective space without necessarily embracing people. And then we go through all the way through to where we have picnic areas and we have walking tracks. We even have a train station in one of them where we've reached this degree of acceptance. We never say people get over grief, but their life has changed and they're now in a different state, which is acceptance. This is my life now, and visiting the cemetery is a part of that. And so we have ways in which they can do that, but in a sense that is not in deep grief. So there are other ways in which they can passively participate in the park. So that's one aspect of the constant. So the other then is the idea that the way in which people express grief is different. We understand that across different faiths and different religions and different traditions, but also that same evolution is going to occur as digital comes on board. And we're seeing a lot of things like QR codes leading to people to have pop-ups on their phone. And we've got a Discover Cemeteries app where you can do a tour of the site, and there are stories that you stop at and pick up on the QR code, and people are doing that differently. AI has started to step into the space where people are pre-recording and then able to use pre-recording, obviously voice modeling, the language model and the history of the person, such that others can then ask that person who is now deceased, they can actually ask the avatar questions about where they grew up, and they will start to get answers. So you get this very virtual expression of talking to the person who's deceased. Now, again, that's early days, Matt, so you can imagine some people are very comfortable with that and some people are extremely challenged by that. But the way in which people express their grief is definitely evolving. And so we're very mindful that whilst we have a connection in the design of the park, there's also got to necessarily be this allowance for evolution over time. So as the park goes through its stages, again, you have to go back and have the consultation again and again and again and maintain that proximity so that you're conscious of those changes as the park evolves.
Very interesting. So Andrew, how does the digital sort of life impact the physical experience, and where would you say your organization is on your digital journey?
There's two quite diverse answers to that, Rondo. The digital impact is something that's emerging, that sits in a space over the top. I think it absolutely belongs, certainly for us, because memorial parks have always been a place of storytelling. Even when we go back to First Nations and the ownership of the land, storytelling was important. And if we look at a memorial park that we often see, or a monument that we see, there's just a very short story there. This person lived, this person was loved by, there's a very short story. Now, when you put the QR codes on top, you've got access to a longer story. So we're still storytelling about that person. So digital absolutely has a place for us in this sense of people wanting to be able to do the storytelling. It's coming through a different means, but it's still essentially the same need for the customer to be able to tell that story, or to be able to express their love for someone in a particular way. So as that evolving as an organisation, which is the second part of the question, are we keeping up and being able to support that technology? Our challenge with digital has got to be that we have a lot of legacy, a lot of data, a lot of records. So each time we try and shift quickly into a new space and adapt, we've got a lot of legacy that we're trying to bring with us at times. So that's probably one of the greater challenges, is this great data set that's behind us that, of course, can't have any errors in it, and trying to bring that through. So digital for us, and I mean that separately from IT, but digital for us is a space that we've got to grow into quicker than we are at times. And I think that's because of, as I was saying earlier, that mindset of don't make a mistake. You cannot make a mistake that would impact the family negatively. And this large legacy that sort of sits there, responding to digital at the speed which it's moving, for us can be quite difficult. So we've built a digital arm into the business, and we've deliberately made it distinct from IT, the traditional IT, because it's not traditional IT. It's actually putting the customer first, as opposed to perhaps some of the more operational IT technology responsibilities and data sets and all of those aspects. Whereas digital is very much in how do I represent, multiply the opportunity? How can I use digital to simplify choice? How can I use digital to, even just with conditional formatting of a field, I can take away risk and those sorts of things. So that sort of language coming into the business that says we're still achieving the same outcomes. It's in a different expression, and as an organisation, we must evolve to be able to support this different expression.
Andrew, is that being pulled by the family, which is your primary customer, I suppose? Or is it a push in a sense that you're trying to stay ahead of the curve, or are you getting the digital native generation sort of pulling you into these changes where many of these touch points have both a physical and a digital expression? You're really curious about that.
It's I think it's both. I think it's both push and pull, Matt. I think, again, we have a very forgiving audience because of the nature of what they're going through. So there's not a lot of demand necessarily for the digital technology. They appreciate it, they would like it. So it's more about missed opportunity in some ways, that we're not stepping into that space. And as you spoke earlier, customer proximity is a space that if you're not in, somebody else is going to step into. I fundamentally believe in the place, the cemetery, the place, and the importance of the place in the fabric of society, in the sense that what it offers society is an opportunity to sit back and actually reflect about the purpose of life just for a moment. And when you do that, often the choices that you'll make in the hours that follow before, the rigors of life come back in, some of those choices just help you reset. And there's a context, I think, around the type of park that we offer that is special. Do we need to have the sense of material purpose that we have now? Do we need to be paying off the car, the house? Do we need the argument with this person? In the context of the brevity of life, you tend to make different decisions about that. And so I think that the park itself has this incredible value. And digital, if it all becomes remote, then the park itself is going to be challenged for its purpose or its deeper meaning, if you like. So it's really important that the two are brought together so that you understand that the digital is an expression of something that's much larger, as opposed to digital is something you can thumb scroll. And then the memory itself, you could just thumb scroll through memories if you would like. But without that context, without that space of quiet reflection, are you actually in that deeper space of truly honouring the memory? And so the two really need to work together. And so there's a sense of urgency, I suppose, that we create that to maintain the relevance of the park and the relevance of the space. Or we'll find that people will just take memories and just start scrolling, and the place itself and its value, its social impact might actually get lost.
So Andrew, I'm just thinking about my experience here in the United States with, I'll call it Deathcare, right? I have a cousin actually, he works in a funeral home here in New York City, and just my experience has been more that it's usually the funeral home, at least in the beginning, that engages with the family, and all of those activities with the cemetery are coordinated through them, etc. And then once the loved one is buried, at least here, I don't find a lot of engagement of the family around the actual cemetery. So I'm just wondering if the experience is different in Australia, and when do you sort of engage or own that relationship with the family from the beginning, or once the funeral home does their thing?
So it's both, Rondo. There's a couple of questions in there, if you like. In terms of the relevance and the visitation afterwards, that is very much faith-based. So we see the trends are very much in the faith. So it depends on the faith as to whether somebody's coming back for a name day or coming back for an anniversary, or some people say, look, I'm just happy to be cremated. So but then what do you do with the ashes themselves? And sadly, some people just pop it in the garden at home. But what happens when you sell the house? Whereas they could actually be returned to the cemetery grounds as well, and then there's a space for people in future to come to. So the answer to the first part is really dependent upon religion, and we see that there is a trend towards cremation, but we also see that there is a point where some religions will not switch to cremation. So there is a point that is a resilience point that says there will always be a need for interment that we can see right now. So I think probably the second part of that question was more around, I think it was the connection. Is that right, Rondo? I might just double check.
Yeah.
When
did you connect with the family?
Yeah. So when our aspiration, again, because we're seeking in ways to reduce the anxiety for the family, our aspiration would be that they are able to approach a cemetery pre-need, before they're in that moment of true cognitive impairment or deep grief, that they're able to come and look at the park and make informed decisions around what they need to do and purchase pre-need. Because the moment they are what we call at need, someone has passed, their first phone call is not to the park, it's off to a funeral director. And again, funeral directors as advocates for the families are very keen around the way they manage the family. And so therefore the full option and the full set of decision-making opportunities are not necessarily presented because we're further downstream in that decision process. And so the person's ability, particularly when they're cognitively impaired, that they're in a very high trust situation, and whatever they're told is what they almost accept. And so therefore having our product range in a space, and even amongst the funeral directors, so that they can project it, getting into those spaces and thinking differently when you're not the first port of call is really important. So it depends on whether you're pre-need or at need, but again, the aspiration for us is to build trust and lower anxiety. They're the things that we would ultimately wish to achieve. They're our signs of success, if you will. I believe that any digital intervention, the best ones are all doing that, which is that build the trust and lower the anxiety. So our aspiration is to get as many people as possible towards that pre-need decision, where they've been able to take the time and look at the products and come around the grounds and actually see what their choices are, so they're more informed.
Interesting.
Very mindful of your time, Andrew. One final question, just to tie off the whole discussion. What does the insurgent mindset mean for you going forward in your organization? And how do you foster and develop that?
It's a challenge, Matt. Probably one thing I would do is get experts like yourself to help us understand it would be one of the things I would do. But the insurgent mindset for us, when you're a company that has been doing the same thing over time and adding one more thing and adding one more thing and adding one more thing, you find yourself in a situation where it becomes a very complex beast. And yet we're trying, or our aspiration again, is to lower anxiety, which when a customer comes to you and you've got 34 choices and they're in grief, they're not looking for 34 choices. So for us, the insurgent mindset is to pick up what we're currently doing, and I'm going to use an old IT term, almost defrag the way in which we're bringing our products to market. You understand from an IT perspective that if you build systems over time and then you delete something behind it, your whole system becomes fragmented. And I think that that's almost a good picture of what an organisation that's been around a long time can do. And so you've got a lot of pieces in your decision-making processes which are just in there and put in there for well-meaning and well-intentioned purposes, but actually have now come to the stage where they're very complex and very difficult for someone that's in the mindset they're in. So we need to look at every process and pick it up. We need to challenge our fears, I suppose, of doing it differently, and that concern we have about negative impact. We have to challenge our fears and put it back into the process. It's something that is faster, more reliable, particularly in our space where people trust us implicitly. And you can imagine that they need to be able to do that. So for us to get into that space where the data is accurate, where our choices are simplified, rationalised through for the customer, there's a lot of work to do in that space to get us from the juggernaut that we've become over time to be something that is able to respond in that fast, simpler and easier mindset.
Terrific, Andrew. Defragmenting. That's a great, I might borrow that. It's a great analogy for those of us that come from a bit of an earlier generation, but
I was going to say it's an early one, Matt.
Of growth. Love it. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us here on the Insurgent Mindset. It's been terrific to hear your story. And I think, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is a part of the economy that doesn't get a lot of attention really in our mainstream thinking. So thank you so much for shedding some light on some of these challenges and giving us a picture of Andrew Erickson as well. We really appreciate it.
It's terrific, Matt. And I appreciate the time and lovely to meet you, Rondo. Thank you.
Yeah, great meeting you, Andrew. Thank you.
All right, terrific. All the best, Andrew. Well, Rondo, that was really interesting to have Andrew here to take us through this journey of really what is a part of the economy we almost never think of, but almost completely at the end of the health value chain, we have, the cemetery trust. And what a fascinating exploration of some of the challenges that feel really familiar in other industries, but have certain elements that are completely unique to this part of our human experience. I love what he talked about in terms of, this universal experience of grief. This is something completely I hadn't considered, never thought about it, but what an anchor point for, all of human history and how to sort of preserve that into the future and also find new ways to bring that experience to life through digital and other means. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, that focus on the digital and how he's bringing it to life through digital was really interesting to me. To hear it talked about in that context was interesting.
And the other thing I thought was fun was to hear the defrag comment, right? So
Hmm.
as you're driving a transformation to bring what is a really conservative industry into the digital age, if you will, he talked about the need to kind of get the get the organization to remove the clutter
Right.
to free up the mind space to be able to operate in this new zone, which I think is
Yeah.
really essential as you're making that kind of incumbent insurgent transition. How do you leave behind the things that aren't really taking you forward, but doing that in a very human way that allows people to let go of these things with confidence?
Yeah, and it's consistent with what we say to clients all the time. Strategy is not just about what you're going to do, is what you're going to not going to do, what you're going to stop doing as well, right? Really being intentional about those decisions as well. Makes sense.
Yeah, I love that word, Rondo, intentional. I think a lot of times we're just not intentional about not enough things, you know what I mean? So it's like if
Yeah.
you're going to make a big change, you have to decide again, what are those things that we're gonna simplify or combine, eliminate, get out of the way? What are the constraints
Right.
that we're gonna manage through? And sometimes that doesn't get enough attention. So I think Andrew's key point was that when you're piling on the change, people get tired, and without sort of freeing up that space and giving people um, an opportunity to do that in a way that doesn't feel like risk to them is really important.
Hmm. Yeah. No, it was great.
So yeah, well, we'll look forward at some point to hearing an update from Andrew how he's dealt with some of these challenges, and what a terrific guest from a very interesting part of our economy.
Absolutely.
All right, well,
Awesome.
thanks, Rondo. Good to see you again, and look forward to our next guest coming up. Maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview of what to expect in a fortnight.
Yeah, so in a couple of weeks, we have the head of the international group of a large appliances manufacturer in Latin America who will be coming to chat with us about his perspective on being an insurgent in the large appliances industry. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
All right, terrific, and our first Latin American guest, so that'll be fun to have a new perspective from a new geography in our burgeoning Insurgent Mindset podcast.